The stench of burnt flesh was still etched into her very pores. It wasn't just from this morning's torment, but from all the nights that bled together when the scorching iron had branded her body over and over. Some of the wounds were still raw, weeping and blistered. Others had already scabbed over, the skin dark, cracked, and irrevocably scarred. Each mark was a brutal testament, a story etched onto her flesh by the same hands that had once held her close, whispering sweet promises of forever. Eliza was slumped against the rough-hewn post inside the oppressive heat of the forge. The ropes binding her wrists were cinched so tightly that they had sliced into her skin, drawing blood. Her swollen belly strained forward, a silent plea for air. But the furnace radiated an unbearable heat, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each one a struggle. Her head lolled, strands of sweat-soaked hair plastered to her cheeks. Her body was a gruesome map of old agonies and fresh cruelties. Every time she shifted, the burns on her thighs shrieked in protest, and the bruises on her arms whispered of countless nights when fists had rained down harder than the hammer on the anvil. The forge roared, the iron glowing a malevolent red in the heart of the flames. The tools of honest labor had been twisted into instruments of torment. She had lost all sense of time, the days blurring into an indistinguishable nightmare. Sometimes Caleb left her tied for hours, forgotten. Sometimes he returned only to shove her closer to the inferno, watching her tears stream down her face as if they were fuel to feed his twisted pleasure. She had once naively believed that his strength was a symbol of protection, that his powerful arms were built to shield her from the unforgiving realities of the West. Now she knew the devastating truth. Those arms were built to break her spirit, to crush her very will to live. Her lips were parched and cracked as she whispered into the echoing silence, "It hurts inside too." The words were a lament not just for her ravaged body, but for her soul, bruised and burned beyond any measure of human endurance. She squeezed her eyes shut, whispering a desperate plea to the child growing within her. "Please, just hold on. Please don't leave me too." The door to the forge creaked open, the sound amplified in the suffocating silence. Heavy footsteps echoed on the dirt floor, each one pounding against her heart. Was he back already? Was this another round of torment? But the figure that stepped into the forge was not Caleb. It was a tall rancher, his worn boots covered in dust from the trail, a bright red scarf tied loosely around his neck. Jed had simply come to buy a new set of horseshoes, completely unaware that hidden behind the swirling smoke of the forge, behind the searing heat of the fire, there was a living nightmare chained to a post. Jed froze in the doorway, his eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. At first, he thought his vision was playing tricks on him, a mirage born of the heat and dust. But then Eliza slowly lifted her head, her eyes glassy with unshed tears, her voice trembling like a dying ember. "It hurts inside too. Please save my baby. If I stay here, I will lose it." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow, cutting through him sharper than any blade. He had witnessed the destructive power of storms that ripped apart ranches, seen men fall in bloody duels under the harsh desert sun. But he had never encountered suffering on this scale, this profound, soul-crushing level. Every scar on her body screamed louder than her whispered plea. This was not the sight of a woman who had simply stumbled upon hard times. This was torture, meticulously planned and utterly merciless. Jed stepped forward, the crunch of his boots against the dirt echoing in the heavy silence. He reached for the ropes, his hands shaking almost uncontrollably as he saw the deep grooves etched into her wrists, the fresh blood staining the coarse fibers. He sliced through the ropes, freeing her from her bonds, and Eliza collapsed into his arms, too weak to support her own weight. Her physical weight was nothing compared to the immense burden of what he had just witnessed, the sheer horror of her suffering. He gently carried her out of the forge, away from the stifling heat and the pervasive smell of burning flesh, into the open air, where the sunlight still managed to pierce through the gloom. The gentle wind caressed her skin, and for the first time in days, maybe even weeks, she breathed in air that wasn't poisoned with smoke and fear. Jed glanced back at the forge, its flames still burning fiercely, its fire still ravenously hungry. What kind of man could condemn his own wife to such a fate, to slowly burn alive like that? And what unspeakable horrors would unfold when that man returned? Jed carefully laid her down on the weathered wooden bench, inside an abandoned shed, not far from the forge. The sun filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting warm shafts of light across her face. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Eliza was breathing air that wasn't tainted with the acrid smell of smoke. He offered her a small flask of water. She drank with trembling hands, spilling droplets down her chin, then pressed her palm gently against her swollen belly, as if trying to soothe the child within. Jed waited in silence, giving her the space she desperately needed. He was not a man given to asking too many questions, especially not at first. The harsh realities of the West had taught him that sometimes answers came only when a soul was ready to unburden itself, to speak its truth. After a long, heavy pause, she whispered, "I used to work at the saloon in town." Her voice cracked, not from shame, but from the overwhelming weight of the memories that flooded her mind. Caleb never trusted me. Every man who even looked my way became a reason for him to lash out, to strike me. People in town started talking too, and those whispers cut just as deep as his fists. Jed said nothing, offering only his unwavering presence. He simply nodded, his eyes steady and filled with compassion, letting her know that he was listening, that he was there to bear witness to her pain. "I ran away once," she continued, her eyes brimming with tears once again. "I thought I could escape. I thought I could start over somewhere new, but I had nowhere to go. After a few weeks I came back, and by then he was already convinced. He said I had been with another man, that the child inside me was not his. From that day on, he made me pay for a sin I never committed." The words hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken suffering. Jed felt his jaw clench, his hands balling into fists. He had seen cruelty in his life, more than his fair share. But this was something else entirely. This was a husband twisting love into a weapon of punishment, a blacksmith who no longer shaped iron, but instead tried to forge fear into the very essence of his own wife's life. Eliza's hands trembled as she gently touched her burns, tracing the edges of the disfigured skin. "These scars," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind, "they are not accidents. He held me near the fire. He pressed the iron close, just to watch me flinch, to see the fear in my eyes. And when I cried, he said I deserved it." Jed clenched his fists tighter, forcing himself to remain calm. A man who had survived for 50 years on the unforgiving frontier knew that anger burned hot and fast, but ultimately faded away. But resolve, true resolve, could move mountains. And right now, he needed every ounce of resolve he possessed. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering, and said, "You are safe now." His voice was low and steady, a comforting anchor in the storm of her pain. "As long as I'm standing, he will never touch you again." For the first time since he had entered the forge, she offered him a faint smile, fragile as morning light, tentatively breaking through storm clouds. But even as she rested, even as Jed promised her protection, the still air outside carried the unmistakable sound of heavy boots approaching. The blacksmith had returned. The sound of the boots grew louder, closer, each step an ominous drumbeat of impending violence. Jed stood up, his hand instinctively moving to rest near the handle of the knife on his belt. Eliza's breath quickened, and she instinctively clutched her belly as if to shield the child from the danger. The door slammed open with a deafening crash, and there he was. Caleb filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking out the light. Sweat and soot were smeared across his face, a mask of fury and desperation. The blacksmith's chest rose and fell like a bull about to charge. His eyes locked on Eliza, then shifted to Jed, assessing the threat. A cruel, twisted smile spread across his face, revealing the darkness that dwelled within him. "So," Caleb growled, his voice a low rumble of barely controlled rage. "I knew it. You ran to him. You always wanted him, didn't you?" Jed remained silent, his expression unreadable. He was not the kind of man to waste words when action might be necessary, when a life hung in the balance. But Eliza shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "No, Caleb, I never—" Her voice cracked with emotion before she could finish the sentence. Caleb raised the heavy blacksmith's hammer he carried, the weight of it a silent threat. "Don't lie to me!" he roared, his voice shaking with fury. "The whole town whispers about you, and now I see it with my own eyes, you in his arms, hiding behind him like a guilty woman." Jed stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Caleb and Eliza. His voice was low but steady, filled with an unwavering resolve. "Put the hammer down, Caleb. She's not guilty of anything, and you know it deep down. You know it." But Caleb was beyond reason, consumed by his own twisted jealousy and rage. With a primal roar, he swung the hammer. Jed reacted instantly, moving with surprising speed. He pulled Eliza behind him, shielding her from the blow, and simultaneously drew the knife from his belt. The hammer crashed against the wooden beam above them, sending splinters flying through the air. Jed countered with a swift slash across Caleb's arm. It wasn't a deep wound, but it was enough to stagger the blacksmith, to break his momentum. The two men circled each other, a deadly dance of predator and prey. One wielded iron, the other steel, the air thick with dust and the metallic tang of blood. Eliza cried out, begging them to stop, but her words were lost in the chaotic clash of wood, fire, and fury. Caleb swung again, his hammer grazing Jed's shoulder, sending a jolt of searing pain down his side. Jed gritted his teeth against the pain, planted his boots firmly in the dirt, and shoved Caleb back with all his strength. For a moment, the blacksmith stumbled, his balance lost, the hammer clattering to the floor. Jed raised his knife, his hand steady, but he did not strike a fatal blow. Instead, his voice thundered across the small space. "Enough, Caleb. You've done enough damage. This ends here." Eliza sobbed, her voice cracking with desperation. "Caleb, please." "The child is yours. Stop before it's too late." For a heartbeat, Caleb froze, his face twisted in a grotesque mask of conflicting emotions, torn between blind rage and a flicker of doubt. But then the distinct sound of approaching hooves thundered outside, growing louder with each passing second. The law had arrived. Jed's eyes never wavered from Caleb's as the marshal's authoritative voice rang out behind them. "Drop the hammer! Step away from the woman!" The blacksmith's fate was now in the hands of justice, and for the first time since entering the forge, Jed felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, Eliza would finally be safe. Now, my friend, if you're still with me, take a sip of tea, lean back, and let this story sink in. Tell me what time it is where you are and where you are listening from. And if you want to keep riding with me through more Wild West stories, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter. The fight shook the walls of the old shed. Jed's knife flashed, Caleb's hammer swung, and the sound of iron striking wood echoed across the field. Dust filled the air, and Eliza cried out, begging them to stop, her voice breaking like glass. Then from outside came the sound of boots. The door swung open, and a deep voice cut through the chaos. "Enough! Put it down!" It was Sheriff Morgan, a man who had ridden these roads longer than most had been alive. He had been on patrol, passing the edge of the property when he heard the clash of steel and the cries of a woman. Now he stood in the doorway, hand resting on his revolver, eyes cold as stone. Jed froze, his chest heaving, his knife still in hand. Caleb glared at the sheriff, his hammer trembling, torn between rage and fear. "This is none of your business, Morgan," Caleb growled. "My wife, my home. Get out!" The sheriff stepped inside, calm but firm. "Not when I hear fighting. Not when I hear her scream. Drop the hammer." For a moment, Caleb hesitated, defiance flickering in his eyes. Then Jed spoke, his voice sharp with anger. "Do as he said. You've done enough damage already." Caleb roared and lunged again, fueled by desperation and fury, but the sheriff was faster. The revolver cleared its holster with practiced ease. The hammer cocked, and the distinct sound of the weapon being armed froze the blacksmith in his tracks. His hammer slipped from his hand, landing with a dull thud on the floor. The sheriff moved quickly, efficiently binding Caleb's wrists with rope, his face unreadable, betraying none of his thoughts. Jed lowered his knife, finally letting out the breath he had been holding, the tension slowly draining from his body. Eliza slid down against the wall, shaking uncontrollably, holding her belly protectively, tears streaming down her face. Morgan glanced at her, then at Jed, his gaze sharp and assessing. "What happened here?" Jed opened his mouth to speak, to explain the horrific scene he had walked into, but Eliza's whisper came first, a barely audible plea. "He hurt me. He tied me up. He wanted me to burn." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. He had long suspected Caleb of being a hard man, prone to anger and violence. But this was something darker, something crueler than the law of the frontier could ignore, something that demanded justice. He looked at the burns on her arms, the cuts on her wrists, the raw, unfiltered terror in her eyes. He tightened the knots around Caleb's hands, pulling him roughly to his feet. "You'll answer for this, Caleb. Every mark on her body will speak louder than your lies." Caleb tried to twist away, shouting curses and denials, but the sheriff dragged him outside into the harsh glare of the sunlight. The blacksmith, who had once stood proud and imposing, was now nothing more than a prisoner, his rage stripped of its power, his freedom gone. Jed helped Eliza up, steadying her as she swayed on her feet. She leaned into him, finding strength in his presence. Her body trembled, but for the first time in a long time, she was no longer alone, no longer facing the darkness by herself. The sheriff looked back at them and nodded, his gaze conveying a silent promise. "This is just the start. We'll get the truth, the whole truth, all of it." And with those words, Jed knew that the fire had not won. Caleb's cruelty had not extinguished Eliza's spirit. But could she ever truly heal from the scars Caleb had left behind, both visible and invisible? Or would they haunt her forever, a constant reminder of the horrors she had endured? The sheriff took Caleb away, his curses and threats fading into the distance until only silence remained, a profound and unsettling silence. Jed stood there in the doorway of the shed, the warm light of the evening sun spilling across his shoulders, a stark contrast to the darkness that had consumed Eliza's life. Eliza leaned against his arm, her body weak and battered, but her spirit still stubbornly alive, refusing to be broken. For the first time in years, she was no longer bound by ropes or by fear. Days turned into weeks, slowly and painstakingly. Jed opened his ranch to her, offering her a sanctuary, a place where the wind carried the scent of fresh grass instead of the acrid stench of smoke, where the only fire burned gently in the hearth, providing warmth and comfort, and not in a forge meant to scar and destroy. Eliza slowly began to heal, both physically and emotionally. The scars on her skin would never completely vanish, serving as a permanent reminder of her ordeal, but the ones on her heart began to soften with each passing day, each kind word, each act of compassion. The constant fear began to recede, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. She found solace in the simple routines of ranch life, in the quiet companionship of Jed, and in the unwavering support he offered. The sound of his steady voice, telling her she was safe, became a balm to her wounded soul. When the time finally came, the joyous cries of a newborn baby filled the ranch house, chasing away the shadows of the past. Jed stood nearby, his rough hands trembling with a mixture of awe and tenderness as he held the child for the first time. Eliza watched through a veil of tears, her heart overflowing with gratitude and love. "You gave us life twice, Jed," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "Once, when you pulled me from the fire, and again when you gave this child a home, a chance at a future." Seasons passed, each one bringing new growth and healing. One afternoon, the little boy, barely steady on his feet, toddled across the porch, his chubby arms outstretched toward Jed, his voice bright and clear. "Papa!" Jed froze, his eyes stinging with tears he couldn't hold back, his heart heavy with a complex mix of emotions he couldn't quite put into words. In that single word, the child had given him something more powerful than any victory, more lasting than any fight, more meaningful than anything he had ever experienced before. He had given him family. And maybe that is the true lesson of this story, the underlying truth that resonates long after the final chapter. The West was a land filled with violence, dust, and men who mistakenly believed that strength came from the fist or the gun, from domination and control. But real strength, the kind that truly mattered, was found in the quiet, unwavering choice to protect, to care, to love, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. Scars may remain, a constant reminder of past pain, but they can also remind us not only of the suffering we have endured, but of our resilience, our ability to survive, to heal, and to rise above the ashes of adversity. Do we allow the fire to define us, to consume us with bitterness and resentment? Or do we rise from it stronger than before, forged in the crucible of hardship, our spirits unbroken, our hearts open to the possibility of love and hope? Now I ask you, my friend, if you were Jed, would you have stepped inside that forge, knowing the danger that awaited you? Would you have risked your life for someone others had already judged, someone society had already cast aside? And if you were Eliza, could you still believe in love after enduring so much cruelty, so much pain and betrayal? Think about that for a moment. Let the weight of those questions settle upon you. And if this story touched you, if it resonated with you in some way, take a second to like the video. It helps more people find these Wild West tales, ensuring that these stories of courage, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit continue to be told. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next ride across the frontier with me. And while you're here, pour yourself another cup of tea, lean back, relax, and tell me in the comments what time it is where you are and where you are listening from. I always enjoy hearing from you and connecting with fellow story lovers from all corners of the world.